Welcome to Blurr, where history's most chilling and mysterious trials come back to life. Tonight, we step into a courtroom filled with whispers, suspicion, and a story that once shocked an entire nation. The trial of Mary Blandy is not just a legal battle. It is a window into the fears, secrets, and emotions of another era. As the proceedings unfold, every word, every testimony, and every moment carries weight. Stay with us as we enter a case that left society questioning truth, loyalty, and justice. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. Now dim the lights, listen closely, and let the trial begin. Chapter 1. Henley-on-Thames and the Blandy family. Henley-on-Thames, in the 1740s, was a prosperous market town on the Oxfordshire stretch of the River Thames, a place of comfortable commerce and gentle social aspiration, where the professional and trading classes maintained their households in the professional and trading classes maintained respectful proximity to the gentry that provincial English life of the period arranged with such practiced ease. It was a town of inns and breweries, of modest but genuine prosperity, and of a social life that revolved around the families of standing who gave it its particular character. Among those families, the Blandys occupied a position of some distinction. Francis Blandy was a solicitor and town clerk of Henley, a man of settled professional position and comfortable means, whose practice gave him an influence and a respectability that extended well beyond the merely financial. He was known to be a man of substance, and the substance was widely believed to be considerably greater than it actually was. There circulated in Henley, and more broadly among the families who knew the Blandys, a persistent and eventually very consequential piece of social misinformation, namely that Mary Blandy, Francis's only surviving child, would inherit upon her father's death a fortune of £10,000. This figure, often cited in the accounts of the case that followed, was a substantial exaggeration of the actual state of the Blandy finances, but its circulation did the work that such misinformation generally does in provincial society. It attracted suitors. Mary Blandy was born in 1720, the daughter of Francis and Anne Blandy. She was educated to the standards of her station, accomplished in the social arts that a woman of her background was expected to master, and described by those who knew her as intelligent, capable, and possessed of a personality that was both strong-ality, and in the way that strong personalities in women were evaluated in the mid-18th century, occasionally perceived as somewhat forward. She was not, by the accounts of contemporaries, a conventional beauty, but she was a woman of presence and intelligence, and she had been, by the time the events of the case began, attempting to establish herself in marriage for a number of years. The difficulty of Mary's position was a common one for women of her generation and her class. She was in her late 20s, unmarried, dependent on her father's household, and surrounded by a provincial society that placed enormous weight on a woman's success or failure in the marriage market. Her supposed fortune of £10,000 ought, in theory, to have made her a desirable match. In practice, the suitors who had appeared over the years had either been found wanting by Francis Blandy, who combined paternal protectiveness with a controlling disposition toward his daughter's future, or had themselves withdrawn when the reality of the Blandy finances proved less impressive than the reputation suggested. Into this atmosphere of frustrated matrimonial expectation, in 1746, arrived Captain William Henry Cranstoun. He was the younger son of a Scottish nobleman, Lord Cranstoun, a man of elegant manner and some social pretension, who had obtained a military commission and who presented himself to the world as a person of birth and prospects that made him, on the surface at least, a suitable candidate for the hand of a well-dowried solicitor's daughter in Henley-on-Thames. The attraction between Cranstoun and Mary was immediate, and on her side at least, profound. What was less immediately apparent was that Cranstoun was already married. Chapter 2. Captain Cranstoun and his complications. William Henry Cranstoun was not quite what he appeared. He was indeed the son of Lord Cranstoun, and he did hold a military commission, but the picture of eligible bachelor that he presented to the Blandy household in Henley was constructed over a foundation of considerable complication that he was careful to keep, for as long as possible, out of view. The most significant of these complications was his marriage to a Scottish woman named Anne Murray, with whom he had a child, and from whom he was not divorced. When the existence of this marriage became known to the Blandy family, the reaction was what might be expected. Francis Blandy was furious and forbade the relationship to continue. Cranstoun, however, was not so easily dislodged. He claimed, and continued to claim for some time, that his marriage to Anne Murray had not been legal, that it had been contracted under circumstances that rendered it void, and that he was pursuing a legal process in Scotland to have it formally annulled. This claim was, to say the least, of doubtful accuracy. The Scottish courts were not, in fact, sympathetic to his position, and the process he described as underway was considerably more uncertain than he represented it as being. Nevertheless, Cranstoun maintained his presence in Henley, continued his pursuit of Mary, and sustained in her a devotion that her father's opposition and his own matrimonial complications had not been able to extinguish. Mary appears to have believed, or to have persuaded herself to believe, that Cranstoun's account of his marriage was accurate, and that the annulment would eventually be forthcoming. Whether this belief was genuine, or whether it was the product of a love so strong that it required the comfort of self-deception, is a question that the evidence of the case allows us to consider, but not finally to resolve. Francis Blandy's opposition to the relationship hardened as the years passed, and as it became increasingly clear that Cranstoun's assurances about the Scottish marriage were not producing the results he had promised. Relations between father and daughter became strained, not entirely without affection on either side, but increasingly complicated by the presence in the household of a relationship that Francis could not approve and that Mary could not abandon. The household in Henley became the setting for a domestic drama that combined financial anxiety, frustrated love, parental control, and the accumulated resentments of a situation that had no easy resolution. It was in this atmosphere that Mary Blandy began to listen when Cranstoun made a suggestion that was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential suggestions in the history of 18th century English crime. He told her that he possessed a powder, a preparation that he had obtained from a woman he described as a Scottish seer or wise woman, which had the property of softening the disposition of anyone to whom it was administered, of making them more amenable, more kindly inclined, and less resistant to what was wanted of them. He suggested that Mary might administer this powder to her father in his food or drink, not to harm him, he insisted, but simply to make him more favorably disposed toward their relationship. He sent her a supply of the powder, and Mary, whose love for Cranstoun had survived every obstacle, began to put it in her father's food. Chapter 3. The powder and its effects. The powder that Cranstoun sent to Mary Blandy, and that she administered to her father over a period of weeks in the summer of 1751, was arsenic. Whether Mary knew this from the beginning is the central question of the case, and it is a question that the trial of 1752 addressed without producing an answer that all subsequent observers have found entirely satisfying. Cranstoun told her it was a love potion, a harmless preparation for softening hearts. The prosecution would argue that she either knew it was poison or had sufficient reason to suspect it, that her ignorance, if genuine, could not excuse what she had done. Francis Blandy began to show the symptoms of arsenic poisoning in the summer of 1751. He became ill with the characteristic symptoms of arsenic administration: the nausea, the vomiting, the burning sensation, the weakness. He was attended by the local apothecary, who noted the symptoms with concern, but did not immediately identify their cause. Various members of the household began to observe that the old man's illness corresponded in its onset with the occasions when he had eaten or drunk particular things, and the suspicion that something was wrong in the food or drink began to form, initially vaguely, and then with increasing specificity. A servant named Susan Gunnell was among the first to act on this suspicion. She observed Mary adding something to her father's food, a white powder stirred into a gruel that was being prepared for the sick man. Gunnell removed the gruel and kept it. She also retrieved some of the discarded preparation from the fire, where Mary had been seen burning papers, and what appeared to be the remnants of a letter from Cranstoun. The retrieved material was sent for chemical analysis, and the analysis was conclusive. The substance was arsenic. Francis Blandy died on August 14, 1751. He was 60 years old. In his final days, according to the accounts that survive, he maintained a remarkable attitude of forgiveness toward his daughter. There are accounts of him telling those around him that he forgave Mary, that he believed she had acted in ignorance of the true nature of what she had given him, and that he hoped she would not be prosecuted. These deathbed sentiments, however movingly expressed, did not prevent what followed. Mary Blandy fled the house the night before her father died, apparently panicking and attempting to reach safety at some distance from Henley. She was recognized and brought back by local people before she had gone far. She was confined in her house initially, and then, after her father's death, she was arrested and committed to Oxford Castle Prison to await trial for her father's murder. The news of the case spread rapidly through the country, generating the intense public interest that a case combining parricide, a romantic attachment, and a young woman in the dock inevitably attracted. Chapter 4. Cranstoun's Role and His Disappearance. Captain Cranstoun, whose supply of arsenic and whose suggestion that Mary use it were at the heart of the case against her, was not present at Mary's trial. He had fled England when the investigation began, crossing to the continent with the speed of a man who understood exactly what his position was and what it implied. He made his way to France and then to the Low Countries, where he died in December 1752, a few months after Mary's execution, in circumstances that the historical record does not fully illuminate. His flight was not merely inconvenient for Mary's defense. It was devastating. Cranstoun was the person who had supplied the powder. Cranstoun was the person who had described it as a love potion. Cranstoun was, on any account of events that gave weight to Mary's claim of innocence, the person primarily responsible for what had happened to Francis Blandy. His absence from the trial meant that this argument could not be made against a present and cross-examinable witness. It meant that the account he had given of the powder's nature, an account that Mary relied upon as the foundation of her defense, could not be tested against his direct evidence. And it meant that the jury was presented with a case that had one of its most significant elements conspicuously and suspiciously absent. The question of whether Cranstoun had told Mary the truth about the powder, whether he had genuinely deceived her with the love potion story, or whether she had known or suspected that the powder was a poison, was a question that only Cranstoun could answer with authority, and Cranstoun had chosen to make himself unavailable. His death in France the same year meant that the question would never be definitively answered, and it has remained open, in the commentary on the case, for the more than 2.5 centuries since the trial. What can be said about Cranstoun on the basis of the evidence is that he was a man of considerable skill in deception who had maintained, for years, a version of himself that concealed an existing marriage and presented false prospects to the woman who loved him. A man capable of sustaining that level of deliberate deception over an extended period was certainly capable of deceiving Mary about the nature of the powder he was sending her. But it is also possible that Mary, who was an intelligent woman in a desperate situation, understood more about the powder than she subsequently admitted. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive, and the truth of the matter may lie somewhere between them. What is clear is that Cranstoun bears a large share of moral responsibility for the death of Francis Blandy, whether or not Mary knew what she was doing. He had obtained arsenic, described it as a harmless powder, sent it to a woman he knew was in a desperate domestic situation, encouraged her to use it on the one person who stood between him and access to her supposed fortune, and then fled when fled. Consequences of his encouragement became apparent. His escape from legal accountability was one of the most satisfying aspects of the case for those who wanted a simple villain, and one of the most frustrating for those who wanted a complete accounting of the moral and legal responsibilities involved. Chapter 5. Oxford Castle and the Waiting. Mary Blandy spent the months between her father's death and her trial in Oxford Castle Prison, confined in circumstances that were, by the standards of 18th century imprisonment, relatively comfortable. She was a gentlewoman, and the prison authorities of the period made accommodations for the social status of their prisoners that modern prisons do not. She had access to books, to visitors, and to a degree of privacy that allowed her to reflect on her situation and to prepare, as best she could, for the ordeal that was coming. She wrote, during her imprisonment, a narrative of the events leading up to her father's death, a document intended to explain her own understanding of what had happened and to present her account of Cranstoun's role in the most favorable possible light for her defense. This narrative, which was later published under the title Miss Mary Blandy's Own Account of the Affair Between Her and Mr. Cranstoun, is one of the most important documents in the case, not because it is necessarily accurate in every detail, but because it reveals the framework within which Mary understood and presented her own actions. In her account, Mary consistently maintained that she had not known the powder was arsenic, that she had believed Cranstoun's description of it as a harmless preparation for influencing her father's disposition, and that she had administered it in complete ignorance of its true nature. She described her love for Cranstoun in terms that were neither coy nor apologetic, acknowledging the depth of her attachment, while insisting that it had never led her to contemplate her father's death. She expressed grief for her father, reproduced versions of his deathbed sentiments of forgiveness, and presented herself as a victim of Cranstoun's deception rather than as his knowing accomplice in murder. The public reception of Mary's account and of her imprisonment was, by the standards of the period, unusually sympathetic. She received a considerable number of visitors, many of them attracted by curiosity, but some by genuine sympathy, and the accounts of those visits that survive suggest that she made in person a favorable impression. She was calm, articulate, and consistent in her account. She expressed appropriate grief for her father and appropriate condemnation of Cranstoun. She presented herself, in short, as exactly the kind of person whose story might be true, which is to say a woman who had been deceived rather than a woman who had been a willing poisoner. Whether the favorable impression she made in prison reflected genuine innocence or reflected the same intelligence and self-possession that had made her a capable manager of a complicated domestic situation over many years, was a question that those who met her could form their own views on. What they could not do, any more than the subsequent jury could, was achieve the certainty about her inner knowledge and intention that a definitive verdict of either guilt or innocence would have required. Chapter 6. The Trial at Oxford. The trial of Mary Blandy took place at the Oxford Assizes on March 3, 1752, before Mr. Justice Leggett. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention, and the courtroom at the Oxford Town Hall was crowded to capacity with observers from Oxford and the surrounding counties who had come to see the woman whose case had been the subject of intense newspaper coverage and public discussion throughout the preceding months. The indictment charged Mary Blandy with the willful murder of her father, Francis Blandy. The prosecution was conducted by the Solicitor General, Sir Dudley Ryder, who appeared in person, an indication of the seriousness with which the government regarded the case. The appearance of a law officer of the Crown at a provincial assizes was unusual, and reflected both the social prominence of the case and the particular gravity that attaches to the charge of parricide, the killing of one's own parent, which English law and English sensibility both treated as among the most heinous of crimes. For the defense, Mary was represented by a barrister whose arguments, while skillfully constructed, faced the fundamental difficulty that the case presented. The defense's task was to establish that Mary had not known the powder she administered was arsenic, that she had been deceived by Cranstoun's love potion story, and that her ignorance of the powder's true nature negated the mental element of murder, which required an intention to kill or cause serious bodily harm. If she had genuinely believed the powder to be harmless, the argument went, she had not committed murder, whatever other offense her conduct might amount to. The prosecution's counter to this was twofold. One, first, that the circumstances of Mary's administration of the powder, the secrecy, the mixing of it into food, the burning of letters from Cranstoun when suspicion began to arise, the flight from the house as her father was dying, were all inconsistent with the behavior of an innocent woman who believed she was giving her father a harmless preparation. An innocent woman did not destroy evidence. An innocent woman did not flee. These were the actions of a person who knew or feared that what she had done was criminal. Second, the prosecution argued that even if Mary had initially believed Cranstoun's account of the powder, the evidence of its effects on her father, the vomiting, the severe illness, the rapid deterioration, was evidence that should have dispelled any reasonable belief in its harmlessness long before the fatal dose was administered. A woman of ordinary intelligence who observed that a preparation she had been giving her father was making him seriously ill was not entitled to continue administering it on the basis of a lover's assurance that it was harmless. The continuation of the administration in the face of visible harm was itself evidence of guilty knowledge, or, at minimum, of a reckless indifference to consequences that amounted to the same thing. Chapter 7. The medical evidence. The medical evidence in the Blandy trial was presented by Dr. Anthony Addington, a physician who had attended Francis Blandy in his final illness and who had conducted or supervised the analysis of the substances recovered from the household. Addington was one of the leading medical practitioners of the Oxford area and a man of considerable professional standing, and his testimony was among the most significant elements of the prosecution's case. Addington testified about Francis Blandy's symptoms and their consistency with arsenic poisoning. He described the course of the old man's illness, the pattern of deterioration, and the post-mortem findings that had confirmed the presence of arsenic in the body. He was precise in his description of the chemical analysis that had been performed on the recovered powder, explaining the tests that had been applied and the conclusions that those tests had established. The substance was arsenic. The quantity found in the body was consistent with repeated administration. The symptoms of the illness were consistent with arsenic poisoning, and with no other obvious diagnosis. The defense cross-examined Addington on the limits of the analysis, and on the possibility that Francis Blandy might have died of natural causes, with any arsenic present in his body being incidental rather than causative. Addington maintained his conclusions with the confidence of a man who had examined the evidence carefully and was satisfied with his analysis. He acknowledged that medicine was not a perfect science, as any honest physician of the period would, but he declined to give ground on his central conclusions about the cause of death. The analysis of the recovered powder, the material that Susan Gunnell had preserved from the gruel and from the fire, was also presented in detail. Addington's testimony established that the white powder recovered was arsenic, of the kind that was then commercially available as rat poison and in other domestic applications. The prosecution connected this powder to the supply that Cranstoun had sent Mary through a chain of evidence that included her own letters, the testimony of servants who had observed her handling the powder, and the circumstantial evidence of timing. The administration of the powder corresponding with the onset and progression of Francis Blandy's illness. The medical evidence was, by the standards of mid-18th century forensic medicine, reasonably robust. The Marsh test for arsenic had not yet been developed. That would come nearly a century later, but the chemical tests available in 1752 were sufficient to identify arsenic with a reasonable degree of confidence, and Addington's testimony represented the best available scientific evidence of the period applied to the specific facts of the case. The defense could challenge the confidence of his conclusions, but could not, on the basis of any alternative scientific account, undermine them fundamentally. Chapter 8. The Servant Evidence. The testimony of the servants of the Blandy household was central to the prosecution's case, and it was among the most damaging evidence that Mary had to confront at her trial. Susan Gunnell, who had observed Mary adding powder to her father's gruel and who had preserved the material for analysis, was the most important of these witnesses, but she was not the only one. Betty Binfield, another servant in the household, testified about her observations of Mary's behavior in the period when Frances Blandy was ill. She described instances of Mary handling powders and adding substances to food and drink intended for her father. She described Mary's demeanor during the illness, the absence of the kind of anxious solicitude that a daughter might be expected to show for a seriously ill father, and various other details of behavior that the prosecution presented as consistent with guilty knowledge. Robert Harmon, the apothecary who had attended Frances Blandy, gave evidence about the course of the illness and about his own observations of the patient's symptoms. He also described conversations he had had with Mary during the illness, including an occasion on which he had expressed concern about the persistence of Frances's symptoms and had questioned whether there might be something in the food or drink that was causing the difficulty. Mary's response to this suggestion, as Harmon described it, was not the response of a woman who was surprised or alarmed by the implication. The cumulative effect of the servant testimony was to paint a picture of a household in which the daughter of the house had been, over a period of weeks, systematically administering a substance to her father while he became progressively more ill. While expressing concern in public that did not appear to her servants to reflect genuine anxiety, and while taking steps to conceal what she was doing when suspicion began to arise. The burning of letters and of the remaining powder, the flight from the house, the attempts to disclaim knowledge of what the powder contained, these were woven together by the prosecution into a narrative of guilty conduct that the defense found very difficult to unravel. The defense challenged the servant witnesses on their observations, on the accuracy of their recollections, and on the possibility that what they had interpreted as guilty concealment might have been innocent behavior misread by people who already suspected their mistress. But the challenge was not entirely convincing, because the behavior described, the specific addition of powder to food, the burning of documents, the flight from the house, were behaviors that were difficult to account for on the basis of innocent ignorance. Chapter 9. Mary's Defense. Mary Blandy's defense, presented by her counsel and supplemented by her own statement to the court, rested on two foundations. The first was the love potion story, the claim that she had believed the powder to be a harmless preparation, whose effect would be to soften her father's disposition, rather than to damage his health. The second was the transfer of moral responsibility to Cranstone, the argument that whatever had happened was the result of Cranstone's deception, and that Mary was a victim of his manipulation, rather than a knowing participant in her father's murder. The love potion defense was not, in itself, implausible as an account of events. It was well known in the 18th century that various preparations were claimed to have the power of influencing people's affections and dispositions, and that such preparations were available from various suppliers of herbal and alchemical remedies. A woman in Mary's situation, deeply in love with a man whose relationship with her was opposed by her father, and told by that man that he possessed a preparation that could resolve her domestic difficulty without harm to anyone, might genuinely have accepted the story. The question was whether a woman of Mary's intelligence, observing the effects of the preparation on her father, would have continued to administer it. The defense argued that Mary had been deceived and that her deception was genuine, that the love and trust she had placed in Cranstoun had made her credulous in a way that her ordinary intelligence would not have permitted, and that the progressive deterioration of her father's health had been attributed by her to natural illness rather than to the preparation she was giving him. This argument had a psychological coherence that was not entirely unconvincing. People in the grip of strong emotions can sustain beliefs that their rational faculties would otherwise dismiss, and the specific combination of love for Cranstoun and the domestic desperation of her situation might have produced exactly the kind of motivated reasoning that the defense was describing. The prosecution attacked this defense with considerable force. If Mary had genuinely believed the powder was harmless, why had she acted with such evident secrecy in administering it? A woman who believes she is giving her father a harmless preparation has no reason to conceal what she is doing. The secrecy itself was evidence that she knew or suspected that the preparation was not harmless. And the burning of the letters from Cranstoun, which contained his instructions about the powder, was the act of a person who understood that those instructions would be damaging if read, not the act of someone who believed they would show nothing but innocent love potion advice. Mary's own conduct in the days immediately preceding and following her father's death was also damaging. She had fled the house. She had been brought back by the community. She had not, in the immediate aftermath of her father's death, presented herself to the authorities to explain her account of what had happened. These were the actions of a person who feared what an investigation would reveal, and fear of investigation was consistent only with knowledge of guilt. Chapter 10. The Father's Forgiveness. One of the most affecting and most discussed elements of the Blandy case was the account of Francis Blandy's attitude toward his daughter in his final days. By several accounts, including some that came from witnesses who testified at the trial, Francis had expressed, even as he lay dying of the poison his daughter had administered to him, a notable reluctance to condemn her. He was said to have told those attending him that he forgave Mary, that he did not believe she had intended to harm him, that he hoped she would not be prosecuted. These sentiments, if accurately reported, are remarkable in their generosity, and they have been interpreted in various ways by those who have studied the case. One interpretation is that they reflect a father's genuine belief in his daughter's innocence, that Francis Blandy died convinced that Mary had not known what she was giving him and had been deceived by Cranstoun. On this reading, the deathbed forgiveness is evidence supporting the love potion defense. Testimony from the most credible possible source, the victim himself, that the crime was the result of deception rather than deliberate intent. Another interpretation is that Francis's sentiments reflected not a belief in Mary's innocence, but a father's love for his child that persisted even in the face of what he knew she had done. A man who understood perfectly well that his daughter had poisoned him might nevertheless, in his dying hours, choose to forgive her and to express that forgiveness in terms that minimized her guilt, out of the parental affection that no amount of betrayal had entirely extinguished. On this reading, the deathbed forgiveness is a measure of Francis Blandy's character, rather than evidence about Mary's knowledge of what the powder contained. A third interpretation is more troubling. It is possible that the accounts of Francis's deathbed sentiments were somewhat embellished or selectively reported by those who wished to present Mary's case in the most sympathetic possible light, and that the image of the forgiving father was deployed by Mary's supporters and eventually by Mary's defense as an element of the narrative that the facts did not entirely support. Deathbed scenes in 18th century accounts are frequently rendered in terms that reflect what the describer wished to convey rather than what was precisely said, and the forensic value of such accounts is correspondingly limited. Whatever the precise accuracy of the reported sentiments, the image of the forgiving father became a powerful element in the cultural reception of the Blandy case, one that made the prosecution and execution of Mary difficult for some observers to accept. and that contributed to the sympathy for her that persisted even after her conviction. The father who forgave his poisoner daughter was a figure that both supported the love potion defense and generated a complex emotional response that the simple narrative of parricide could not fully contain. Chapter 11. The Law of Parricide. The charge of parricide, the killing of one's own parent, was treated in English law and English society with a specific gravity that distinguished it from other murders. It was not, strictly speaking, a separate offense from murder in general, since English law did not maintain the Roman law distinction between parricide and other homicides that had given parricide its own specific penalties and its own particular shame. Moral condemnation. But the social and moral weight attached to the killing of a parent was, in mid-18th century England, very considerable, and it shaped the reception of Mary's case in ways that went beyond the purely legal. The connection between the crime and the specific social relationship of parent and child gave the Blandy case a dimension that straightforward murder cases did not possess. The family was the fundamental unit of the social order in 18th century England, and the authority of the parent over the child was one of the basic structures through which that order was maintained. A child who killed a parent was not merely a murderer, but a person who had attacked the very foundation of the social arrangement on which everything else rested. The parricide violated the most intimate and most basic of human bonds, and the horror attached to the offense reflected the depth of the violation. This framing of the crime had implications for Mary's trial that went beyond the legal. The jury was not being asked only whether Mary had committed the technical elements of the crime of murder. They were being asked whether this woman had killed her own father, a man who had, whatever his faults and whatever the domestic friction that his possessiveness had generated, loved her and protected her throughout her life. The emotional weight of that question was not something that could be entirely separated from the legal one, and the social meaning of parricide shaped the atmosphere of the trial in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. For Mary's defense, the parricide framing was doubly dangerous. Not only did it make the crime she was charged with appear in the most terrible possible light, it also made the love potion defense more difficult to sustain. A woman who had poisoned her father for a lover, even if she had not known she was poisoning him, had behaved in a way that was morally indefensible, regardless of her technical knowledge of the powder's nature. She had allowed her desire for Cranstoun to override her duty to her father, had used her father as an instrument of a scheme she had not questioned with the care that her duty as a daughter demanded, and had continued to administer a preparation whose effects she had observed without the moral seriousness that filial piety required. The love potion defense could, if successful, establish legal innocence of the specific charge of murder. It could not restore the moral credit that the facts of the case, however interpreted, had destroyed. Chapter 12. The Verdict and the Sentence. The trial lasted a single day, as most 18th century criminal trials did. The evidence was presented, the witnesses were examined and cross-examined, the counsel addressed the jury, the judge summed up, and the jury retired to consider their verdict. The deliberation was not extended. In a case where the facts were as clearly established as they were in the Blandy case, the question for the jury was essentially the legal and moral one of Mary's knowledge and intention, and the evidence bearing on that question pointed cumulatively and persuasively in one direction. The jury found Mary Blandy guilty of the murder of her father. The verdict was received in the courtroom with the gravity appropriate to a capital case, and the judge, Mr. Justice Lega, pronounced the sentence of death with the formality that the occasion demanded. Mary received the verdict and the sentence with the composure that had characterized her conduct throughout her imprisonment and her trial. She did not weep, did not collapse, and did not make any dramatic declaration of innocence or protest against the verdict. She accepted the judicial conclusion with a steadiness that some observers found admirable and others found, in the context of the crime, slightly unsettling. the sentence of death by hanging was pronounced. The question of whether her body would be gibbeted after execution, as had been done with Eugene Aram, and with others convicted of particularly heinous crimes, was raised and resolved in the negative. Mary Blandy was a gentlewoman, and the gibbeting of her body would have been inconsistent with the social treatment due to a person of her station, whatever crime she had committed. She would be hanged, and her body would be returned to her family for burial. In the period between the verdict and the execution, Mary remained at Oxford Castle under the care of the prison authorities and the chaplain. She received visitors, maintained her composure, continued to profess her innocence of any intention to harm her father, and prepared herself, with the assistance of the prison chaplain, for what was to come. Various accounts of her final days were subsequently published, as was common with celebrated criminals of the period, and these accounts added detail and texture to the public record of the case while also inevitably shaping the narrative in ways that reflected the perspectives and purposes of those who produced them. Chapter 13. The Execution of Mary Blandy. Mary Blandy was executed on April 6, 1752, at the Oxford Castle gallows. She was 31 years old. The execution was attended by a substantial crowd, as public executions in the 18th century generally were, and the accounts that survive suggest that Mary maintained, to the end, the dignity and composure that had impressed observers. Throughout her imprisonment, she walked to the gallows with the assistance of the prison chaplain, who had provided her spiritual care during her final weeks and who accompanied her through the final ritual. Various accounts describe her final words, which varied somewhat in their reported form, but which consistently expressed her continued profession of innocence in the specific sense that she had not knowingly administered a poison to her father, and her forgiveness of those who had brought her to this pass, including, perhaps with some complexity of feeling, Cranstown. One detail from the accounts of the execution that has been frequently cited is a remark attributed to Mary about the position of the gallows relative to the ground. It was reported that she requested not to be hanged too high, on the grounds of modesty, a concern for the dignity of her appearance in death that is simultaneously touching and darkly comic, and that has always been one of the most human and most quoted moments in the story of her case. Whether the remark was made in precisely those terms, or whether it was embellished in the retelling, cannot now be determined, but its survival in the record speaks to the impression that Mary Blandy made on those who observed her, an impression of a person who maintained, even in the most extreme circumstances, a concern for the ordinary human proprieties. She was buried, as had been arranged in the church at Henley-on-Thames, in the grave of her mother, who had predeceased her, close to the place where she had grown up and where her father would also eventually be buried. The reunion of the family in death was a detail that the sentimentally inclined found affecting, and that the morally severe found inadequate compensation for what had happened during their lives. The grave in Henley remains, and for those who make their way to it with the case in mind, it is a strange and somehow appropriate conclusion to a story that began and ended in that prosperous Thames-side town. Chapter 14. Was she guilty? The question of whether Mary Blandy was guilty of murder, in the full legal sense of having knowingly administered a poison to her father with the intention of causing his death, has been debated since the trial, and has not been resolved to the universal satisfaction of those who have examined the evidence. The jury found her guilty. The judge sentenced her to death, and she was executed. But the not proven verdict of Scottish law, which was not available in the English jurisdiction where she was tried, might have captured something of the genuine uncertainty that the case presents more honestly than the binary of guilty and not guilty allowed. The case for her guilt is substantial. She administered arsenic to her father over a period of weeks. She did so secretly, mixing it into his food and drink. When suspicion arose, she burned the letters from Cranstoun that contained instructions about the powder. She fled the house as her father was dying. These are the actions of a person who knew or suspected that what she was doing was seriously harmful, and the accumulation of them is difficult to explain on the basis of innocent ignorance. The case for her innocence, or at least for reasonable doubt, is also serious. She loved Cranstoun with a depth that may have made her credulous about the powder's nature. Cranstoun was a skilled deceiver who had successfully maintained a false identity to her for years, presenting himself as an eligible bachelor while concealing his existing marriage. A man capable of that degree of deception was certainly capable of deceiving her about the nature of a powder. The love potion story was not intrinsically implausible in the context of 18th century popular belief about such preparations, and her father's own deathbed sentiments, if accurately reported, suggest that the person most directly affected by what she had done did not believe she had intended to kill him. The burning of the letters and the flight are perhaps the most damaging elements for the innocence theory, and they require some account to be given that does not imply guilty knowledge. The most sympathetic account is that Mary, horrified by what was happening to her father, and beginning to suspect that Cranstoun's powder was not what he had claimed, burned the letters in a panic, and fled not because she knew she was a poisoner, but because she feared that she might have been deceived into acting as one, and that the consequences of that deception would fall entirely on her. A woman who had just begun to realize that the man she loved had given her poison to administer to her father, and who was watching her father die, might well have destroyed his letters and fled in a state of terror and grief that was not equivalent to the composed, premeditated conduct of a deliberate poisoner. This more sympathetic reading is possible. It is consistent with at least some of the evidence, but it requires the acceptance of a number of propositions about Mary's state of mind and her understanding of events that the prosecution was able to challenge effectively, and the jury was entitled, on the basis of the evidence before them, to find that the simpler explanation of knowing participation in her father's murder was the more probable one. The honest historical verdict is that Mary Blandy was probably guilty of knowingly administering arsenic to her father, but that the certainty required for a capital conviction was, in the view of some who have studied the case, somewhat greater than that the evidence could definitively sustain. Chapter 15. The question of Cranstoun's culpability. The escape of Captain Cranstoun from any legal accountability for his role in Frances Blandy's death is one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case, and it deserves extended consideration because the allocation of moral and legal responsibility between Cranstoun and Mary is not the straightforward matter that a simple focus on Mary's trial might suggest. Cranstoun obtained the arsenic. Cranstoun described it as a harmless love potion. Cranstoun sent it to Mary with instructions about how to use it. Cranstoun knew, or must have known, that Mary was in a domestic situation where the temptation to use such a preparation on her obstructive father was very great. And Cranstoun stood to benefit very directly from the death of Frances Blandy, who was the principal obstacle between him and access to the fortune that Mary was believed to possess. On this account, Cranstoun was not merely the supplier of the means of murder, he was the architect of the scheme, the person who had identified the opportunity, obtained the instrument, prepared the agent, and then absented himself at the moment when the consequences of the scheme became apparent. If Mary was guilty of murder, Cranstoun was at least equally guilty, and on some accounts considerably more so, because his role in conceiving and enabling the poisoning was more deliberate and more calculating than Mary's role in carrying it out. The law of the period had the mechanisms to deal with Cranstoun's culpability. He could have been charged as an accessory before the fact to the murder of Frances Blandy, a serious charge that carried the same penalty as the principal offense. He could, in theory, have been extradited from France if the diplomatic relations between England and France had made that a practical possibility, which in 1752 they did not. His death in December of the same year ended the question of his legal liability permanently, but it left open the moral question of whether the full weight of responsibility for Frances Blandy's death was properly placed on his daughter's shoulders, or whether it should have been distributed, at least in part, to the man who had created the conditions for the crime. The public reception of the case recognized Cranstoun's culpability to a degree. He was widely condemned in the press and in the pamphlets that circulated in connection with the case, and the narrative of Mary as Cranstoun's victim, rather than as an independent agent of her father's murder, was one that had significant public sympathy. But sympathy for the condemned woman did not change the legal outcome, and the asymmetry between Mary's execution and Cranstoun's death in obscurity in France remained one of the most persistently unsatisfying aspects of a case that resisted clean resolution in many of its dimensions. Chapter 16. Women, Love, and Poison in 18th Century England. The Blandy case sits within a broader pattern of 18th century criminal cases involving women and poison that reveals something important about the social and psychological realities of women's lives in that period, and about the particular ways in which those realities could intersect with the ready availability of arsenic in the domestic environment. Poison was, in many ways, the weapon of the powerless. For women in 18th century England, direct physical violence against a male authority figure was practically impossible. A woman who wished to remove the obstacle that a father or a husband represented had no legitimate mechanism for doing so, and no physical capacity, in most cases, for doing so through violence. What she had was access to the food and drink of the household, and what the household contained, in the form of rat poisons and various other domestic preparations, was frequently arsenic. The combination of powerlessness, access, and the ready availability of a lethal substance created the conditions for exactly the kind of crime that the Blandy case represented. The role of Cranstoun in the Blandy case as the external agent who supplied the poison while maintaining his own distance from the act of administering it also reflects a pattern that appears in various forms in other cases of the period. The manipulation of a vulnerable woman by a man who used her love and her domestic desperation as instruments of a scheme whose primary beneficiary was himself was not a phenomenon unique to Cranstoun, and the particular combination of romantic deception and criminal exploitation that he practiced was one that the social arrangements of the period made dangerously easy. Mary's situation, as a woman in her late 20s, whose only realistic prospect of independence from her father's household was a successful marriage, and whose one serious attachment was to a man her father would not approve, was a situation of genuine desperation that is easy to understand even when the actions it produced are impossible to condone. The love potion story, whatever its precise accuracy as an account of Mary's knowledge, captures something true about the state of mind in which a woman in her position might have made the choices she made. When legitimate routes to the life you need are blocked, and when someone offers you what appears to be a harmless alternative, the temptation to take it is human rather than monstrous, even if the alternative turns out to be something very different from what it was represented as. This does not excuse what Mary did. It contextualizes it. And contextualizing it matters, not to diminish the seriousness of the crime or the reality of Frances Blandy's death, but to understand how a woman of apparent intelligence and apparent moral seriousness arrived at the point of administering arsenic to her own father. The answer lies not in some inherent villainy of character, but in the specific social arrangements that had made her position one in which the temptation Cranstoun offered had a power that her ordinary moral faculties were not sufficient to resist. Chapter 17. The Published Accounts and Public Opinion. The Blandy case generated an extraordinary quantity of published material, both before and after the trial, reflecting the intense public interest that it had attracted and the multiple narrative possibilities that it offered to writers of different orientations. Pamphlets, broadsides, trial accounts, and extended commentaries appeared in considerable numbers, and they collectively represent one of the more substantial bodies of contemporary documentation for any 18th century criminal case. Mary's own account, published during her imprisonment, was one of the first and most significant of these publications. It was, as already noted, a carefully constructed document that presented her case in the most favorable possible light, while acknowledging the facts that could not be denied. It was widely read and widely discussed, and it contributed substantially to the public sympathy for Mary that was notable throughout the period of her imprisonment and execution. Several pamphlets appeared that took the opposing view, presenting the evidence of the trial in terms that emphasized Mary's guilt and rejecting the love potion defense as the invention of a woman who had made a calculating choice and was now attempting to escape its consequences by attributing responsibility to a man who had conveniently made himself unavailable. These accounts drew on the servant testimony, the burning of the letters, the flight from the house, and the general pattern of guilty conduct to argue that the jury had reached the correct verdict and that the execution was just. A third category of publication addressed the case from the perspective of moral and social commentary, using the story of Mary Blandy as an occasion for reflection on the dangers of passionate attachment, the obligations of filial piety, the vulnerability of women to unscrupulous men, and the conditions of provincial English society that had created the situation in which the crime had occurred. These more reflective treatments often showed a genuine ambivalence about Mary's guilt and a sympathy for her situation that the purely prosecutorial accounts did not permit themselves. The cumulative effect of this publication was to establish Mary Blandy as a figure of cultural significance that outlasted the immediate circumstances of her case. She became, in the decades after her execution, a reference point for discussions of women, crime, love, and the law that her specific case had made possible, and her story was cited, adapted, and reimagined in contexts that went well beyond theon. Legal proceedings at Oxford in 1752, Chapter 18. The Blandy Case in Legal History. The trial of Mary Blandy occupies a specific place in the history of English criminal law, though its significance is less dramatic than that of some of the other cases examined in this series. It did not produce new legal principles or generate landmark rulings. It did not force changes in criminal procedure or in the rules of evidence. What it did was illustrate, with particular clarity, the application of the existing law to a case of domestic poisoning in circumstances where the key question of mental intent was deeply contested, and where the evidence bore on that question in complex and ambiguous ways. The case is frequently cited in discussions of the mens rea requirement in murder, the principle that a conviction requires not only proof of the act of killing, but proof of the mental element, specifically the intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. Mary's defense was, in essence, a mens rea defense. She had administered the powder. She did not deny that. But she had not intended to harm her father, and without that intention the legal elements of murder were not, she argued, complete. The jury's rejection of this defense, and the judge's charge that supported the rejection, illustrate the principle that a person who administers a dangerous substance to another, however firmly they may believe it to be harmless, takes on a legal and moral responsibility for the consequences that cannot be entirely transferred to the person who deceived them about its nature. The case also contributes to the history of the law's treatment of accomplice relationships and the allocation of criminal responsibility between parties to a crime. Cranstoun's role as the supplier and instigator who escaped accountability raised questions about the reach of criminal liability that the law of the period had limited capacity to address. The subsequent development of the law of accessory liability, which has expanded considerably in the centuries since the Blandy case, would in theory be capable of addressing his culpability in a way that the law of 1752 was not. More broadly, the case is part of a pattern of mid-18th century poisoning cases that contributed to the eventual development of more sophisticated forensic toxicological capabilities, and to the extension of the legal framework governing the sale and use of dangerous substances. The Arsenic Act of 1851, which established requirements for the coloring and registration of arsenic sales in Britain, was a response to a century's worth of arsenic poisoning cases, of which the Blandy case was one of the earlier and most prominent examples. The connection between the specific case and the eventual legislative response is not direct or linear, but the accumulation of cases like this one provided the social context within which the eventual reform became both possible and necessary. Chapter 19. The Literary Afterlife. Mary Blandy's story attracted literary attention in the decades and centuries after her execution, though the literary engagement with her case has been less extensive and less celebrated than the cultural responses to some of the other criminal cases of the period. She has never been the subject of a major novel or a celebrated poem in the way that Eugene Aram was, and the Blandy case has not generated the kind of sustained literary mythology that attached to Aram or to some of the Victorian poisoning cases. But she has not been forgotten, and the literary and dramatic treatments of her story reflect the genuine complexity and genuine interest of a case that resists simple categorization. Several dramatic works addressed the Blandy case in the 18th and early 19th centuries, generally presenting Mary as a tragic figure caught between filial duty and romantic love, whose crime, if it was a crime, arose from the most human of those failings rather than from any exceptional wickedness of character. These dramatic treatments tended to emphasize the sympathetic elements of her story: the devoted daughter, the deceiving lover, the forgiving father, and to present the prosecution and execution as if not unjust, at least disproportionate to the human realities of the situation. Historical novelists of the 19th and 20th centuries returned to the case periodically, drawn by the combination of its documentary richness, the multiple published accounts that gave them materials to work with, and its narrative possibilities: the provincial setting, the romantic attachment, the domestic poisoning, the trial, and the execution. These novelistic treatments inevitably involved interpretation and invention, filling in the gaps in the historical record, with the novelist's license to imagine what the documentary record could not establish. The most thoughtful of them acknowledged the irreducible ambiguity at the heart of the case, the impossibility of knowing with certainty what Mary Blandy knew when she mixed the powder into her father's food. The case has also attracted the attention of historians of crime and of women's history in the 20th and 21st centuries, who have found in it a rich source of material for the study of women's lives, women's legal position, and the specific social conditions of mid-18th century England. These scholarly treatments have generally been more interested in the contextual questions, what the case reveals about its time and place and about the social arrangements that made it possible, than in the specific question of Mary's guilt. The guilt question has not been entirely avoided even in the most contextually oriented accounts. Chapter 20. What the case of Mary Blandy means. Mary Blandy was hanged at Oxford Castle on April 6, 1752. She was buried at Henley-on-Thames, in the town where she had grown up, where she had fallen in love with William Henry Cranstoun, and where she had mixed arsenic into her father's gruel in the summer of 1751. Cranstoun died in France in December of the same year, without having faced any legal accounting for his role in the events that had sent her to the gallows. Francis Blandy, who had forgiven his daughter on his deathbed, was buried near her in the same churchyard. And the story of what had happened in that Henley household, which had generated such intense public attention at the time, gradually became a matter for the historians and the scholars who found in it material that time had not exhausted. What does the case of Mary Blandy mean? it means several things that are not entirely comfortable. It means that the law's treatment of women who acted against male authority in the mid-18th century was both rigorous and somewhat selective in its rigorousness, pursuing the woman who administered the poison to the point of execution, while allowing the man who supplied it and directed its use to die in undisturbed obscurity in a French town. The asymmetry of the legal outcomes reflected both the practical limitations of cross-border prosecution in the period and the specific social and legal framework within which women's agency was understood and punished in ways that a man's equivalent agency, operating through a woman rather than directly, could more easily escape. It means that the crime of parricide, understood in its social and psychological context, is not always the simple expression of pure wickedness that the horror it generates might suggest. Mary Blandy killed her father, or participated in his killing, in circumstances that were created in large part by the social arrangements that had left her without any legitimate route to the future she needed. Her love for Cranstoun, her domestic desperation, her father's controlling possessiveness, her lack of any independent means or any realistic alternative to the household she was trying to escape. These were the conditions that the crime grew from. The crime was real. The responsibility was real. But the social soil in which it grew was also real, and a full accounting of the case requires acknowledgement of that soil, as well as of the individual choices that were made within it. It means that the relationship between love and judgment is one of the most dangerous and most recurrent themes in human affairs, and that the specific form this danger takes in women's lives has historically been shaped by the social constraints that limited their legitimate choices and left them vulnerable to the particular kind of manipulation that Cranstoun practiced. A woman who has no other route to independence, except through the man she loves, is a woman who is deeply vulnerable to that man's deceptions, and the history of the Blandy case is, among other things, a history of that vulnerability finding its most extreme expression. And it means, finally, that the cases that most persistently resist resolution, that remain genuinely debated long after the formal legal proceedings have concluded and the participants have died, are the cases that reflect genuine moral complexity rather than simple wickedness. The question of whether Mary Blandy knew what she was doing when she mixed the powder into her father's gruel is a question that the evidence allows but does not compel us to answer, and the persistence of that question across more than 2.5 centuries of legal, historical, and literary attention is itself a measure of the genuine uncertainty at the heart of the case. We cannot know what Mary Blandy knew. We cannot know whether Cranstoun deceived her completely, or whether she deceived herself, or whether her love for him made the boundary between those two possibilities genuinely difficult to locate. What we can know is that a woman died for what she did, that the man most responsible for creating the conditions for it died in comfortable obscurity, and that the story of their entanglement and its consequences raises questions about justice, about love, about the social conditions of women's lives, and about the irreducible limits of what any legal system can determine about the most private recesses of human intention. These are not questions that have simple answers. They are questions that each generation must engage with on its own terms, bringing to them the understanding of human nature and the standards of justice that their time and experience make available. The case of Mary Blandy was one particular engagement with those questions, conducted in a courtroom in Oxford in the spring of 1752, and it produced a verdict that was legally proper, historically consequential, and humanly insufficient in the way that all verdicts in cases of genuine complexity must ultimately be. This has been the story of Mary Blandy, of Frances Blandy, of Captain William Henry Cranstoun, and of a trial that placed one of them at the center of a legal and moral reckoning that has never entirely concluded. Thank you for listening.